have seen my interview with Jason Silva that happened at AFES Bali. Now what we want to do is go behind the scenes just for you guys to ask Jason some deeper questions and to have our mind blown with the mind of Jason Silva. On stage, you said something that I thought was extremely brave. When somebody asked you, you're such an optimist for everything that's happening in the world right now. You're such a proponent for transhumanism and exponential technological change. And you even said that technology will cure some of the biggest things that's happening in the world, such as global warming. But you said the one thing that worries you is nationalism.
Yeah. Why is the question?
Why?
Yeah. I grew up in Venezuela, which for many years was a prosperous nation, one of the richest nations, if not the richest nation in South America, a giant middle class, just a model, a place that people around the world wanted to move to. And, granted, bad policies in that country eventually led to social inequality that was unsustainable. And then Hugo Chavez got elected, feeding on the frustration of the people as a kind of Robin Hoodian figure that would take from the rich and give to the poor. But his fervor, his rhetoric, the vitriol was that kind of hyper nationalism, and this kind of like screw the world and like screw building bridges, and it's all about like us and what we're gonna do, and we're a sovereign nation and we don't care about anybody else. And it was just like, it was ugly and it was angry, and it has like crippled Venezuela. And he's dead now, and his successor is even worse.
Is even worse.
Maduro is even worse, and the hyperinflation and the if people think that there was poor people or suffering in Venezuela before, like now people are starving, you know what I mean? Like now people can't get medicine. The situation is unsustainably horrible. And it carries the signature nationalist.
Now I see where that came from. I knew you were Venezuelan American. Somehow I never made that connection. Now
I lived that directly. I was like literally finishing high school.
So just two questions over there, because this is a fascinating topic. Fox News said, I just was watching this thing on Fox News. Fox News said, I mean, if you can really call it news, that it wasn't nationalism, it was socialism, and Bernie Sanders is going to get us there. Your thoughts?
Well, I think the problem is that these terms get hijacked for particular agendas. I think if you look at the model in Cuba, that is a totalitarian regime that curtails the press and holds people down and has like secret Gestapo police if you dissent in any way, and they call that like a socialist revolution. And Hugo Chavez totally took that from Castro, and we're like, the socialist revolution, but that's very different than like the socialist capitalist democracies like the Netherlands or Scandinavia. I personally think that the Netherlands is one of the most successful countries in the world. I spent so much time in Amsterdam, and I love that they are highly egalitarian, but also highly educated, that they have complete freedom of the press, and that they have rule of law, and that they have a capitalist engine, but then, people pay their taxes, and you have free education, free health care of the highest order.
Perfect. That's what I wanted to bring up, right? Because a lot of Americans confuse socialism with social democracy. Socialism, derived from communism, which is Venezuela, which is Cuba, is fucking horrible. My wife's family grew up in Soviet Russia. We had family members murdered by the Soviets, land taken away, fucking horrible. But Estonia today, which is where my wife's family is from, as in Denmark, as in Norway, have some of the highest standards of living in the world, and that is social democracy. Excellent. But now I get that nationalism thing.
Definitely.
Now let's get on to a more positive note.
Sure.
Being a wonder junkie. Now, you describe yourself as a wonder junkie. Explain to us what this is and what can we learn from that.
So I'm a big fan of Carl Sagan, the famous astronomer, and he used to contemplate space and time on a scale just shy of the infinite, and there was poetry in his contemplation. You could tell that the guy was drunk on awe. The way that he articulated both the sublime mystery of the cosmos and our desire to understand such a mystery resonated with me to no end. One of my favorite films growing up was Contact, and that was a Robert Zemeckis film based on a novel that Carl Sagan wrote called Contact. So he was the original novelist behind what I think is one of the best science fiction stories of all time. And in the novel, he was describing the Ellie Arroway character, who Jodie Foster played in the film. And he described her as a wonder junkie when trying to capture the essence of that fire in the belly, that faint disquiet, that insatiable curiosity with which she probed at the infinity of the cosmos. Like when she looked at the stars, when she contemplated space and time, it agitated her soul. You know, there was this ecstatic question asking. And he referred to as a wonder junkie, which is a strong word, right? Because you think of a junkie, you think of a heroin addict. But so essentially he was saying, well, that's kind of what it is. It's like you're addicted the way a heroin addict is addicted to heroin, but you're addicted to wonder. And I mean, that spoke to me so much that I felt like finally somebody gets me. You know, right. I found myself reflected in that phrase. And there's another phrase that speaks directly to that thirst as well. It's a line by F. Scott Fitzgerald that I might have referenced in my speech. F. Scott Fitzgerald this was from an essay called The Death of Awe in the Age of Awesome. and so the author was, Henry Weismeyer, was quoting F. Scott Fitzgerald from a line where he was describing Dutch sailors discovering the New World for the first time. So this notion of seeing the fresh green breast of a new world. And the line was, "Man must have held his breath, compelled into an aesthetic contemplation he neither understood nor desired, face to face, perhaps for the last time in history, with something commensurate to his capacity for wonder." Wow. And so it's like something commensurate to his capacity for wonder, because jadedness or cynicism, what Michael Pollan calls the been-theres and seen-thats of the adult mind, that assumption that we've seen it all before, that nothing really impresses us, that we don't really have to engage with anything because we know what that is, so we can dispense with what's happening and leapfrog to the conclusion. Been there, done that, so to speak, which is such a contemporary thing these days. He says that comes from a lack of an experiential jolt that thrusts you back into the mystery again, you know? That you can have an experience where you're cracked open that is finally commensurate with your capacity for wonder. And one of my demons, I think, is that I'm terrified of becoming jaded. Mm-hmm. You know, for me, like, existential despair is to think that, okay, that's all there is, and there's nothing else, and there's no more awe, and there's just resignation. And so I'm addicted to, I think, novelty. I'm addicted to new experiences, to new ideas, you know, to new forms of understanding, and I work really hard to seek out experiences that are commensurate to my capacity for wonder, because it's very big.
That seems like a really remarkable way to live life. Now, doesn't that though get you in situations where you're freaking frustrated because there isn't enough wonder happening in your life? Doesn't it make it hard to settle in one city or stick to one job or one relationship? Yes.
I think that's actually one of the hardest things. I think that in my own life, I remember living in Los Angeles for 5 years, working as a television presenter, and you know, I was living the dream. I'm in Los Angeles, I'm going to parties in the hills, I'm meeting celebrities, I'm dating actresses, like life was good, until that was all there was, until it became so familiar. And they say familiarity deadens, you know, routine makes everything stale, or at least it tends to. And that has to do with something called hedonic adaptation. So things that give us pleasure eventually don't give us as much pleasure. It's why people who do cocaine report never being able to get the same high they got the first time. I wouldn't know, I've never done cocaine, but this notion of hedonic adaptation speaks to me very much, because I think it can happen in every context. Things that give pleasure just don't give as much pleasure once you adapt to them, once you normalize to them, and so you have to shake things up in your own life. Now, not all of us are lucky enough to travel the world, you know, to be exposed to different people, but you can be exposed to different books, you know, you can go down different rabbit holes on the internet, you can take a different commute to work, you can take up a different hobby, anything that thrusts you into a new world, you know. And sometimes it doesn't even mean that you'll find what you're looking for, but that the search is enough. I think it was Walker Percy who wrote this line from The Moviegoer that I love. He says, "The search is what anyone would undertake if they were not sunk in the everydayness of their own lives." And just to become aware of the possibility of the search, just the possibility of the search, is to be onto something. And not to be onto something is to be in despair. So, I mean, I'm sure that resonates with you too, because sometimes it's just the possibility.
Right.
Like, what's beyond that corner? You know, what's over there? Who am I going to meet tomorrow? What new email is going to come in? You know,
right.
and organizing my life so that surprises consistently arrive has been very important to me.
That's amazing, and it puts you in this perpetual state of joy and gratitude, and it's a beautiful way to live.
Just to live live the questions and to be constantly seeking. You know.
So I want to talk about states of flow. Right? You and I are big fans of Stephen Kotler and Jamie Wise, and we have mutual friends, and you spoke about flow a lot when you were on stage.
Yeah.
What is this state of consciousness to you?
Yeah. So the father of flow, so to speak, is a guy called Csikszentmihalyi. Most people can't pronounce his name, but Kotler taught me the pronunciation. So Csikszentmihalyi wrote a book called Beyond Boredom and Anxiety. And typically human beings oscillate between these states of boredom and or anxiety, or even like depression. The point is, like, we're anxious about the future, or we're melancholic for the past, and that's like this constant fibrillation. Especially now, it's acute, this 21st century normal. Like, we're so nervous, we feel so much pressure. But there are these moments in our lives where everything aligns, where things run smoothly, when we lose ourselves in an experience, when we lose track of time. It can happen, you know, the jazz musician when he's in the pocket, you know, the athlete when he's in the zone, the writer when it comes through him but not from him, and though it is with him, it belongs not to him. I mean, you feel, as an artist at least, like a conduit to something larger than yourself. And this particular experience, this state of consciousness that is defined as flow, is one in which you feel your best and you perform your best. And it seems to emerge under all these different conditions. People have different triggers. There are different contexts in which this particular flavor of consciousness emerges. And researchers and authors like Stephen Kotler and his organization, the Flow Genome Project, have pioneered some of the research into this space. They're building on the work of Csikszentmihalyi. And as it turns out, when people are in flow, again, not only do they feel their best, not only do they perform their best, but like existentially it puts them in the right space, because they're not so concerned about the future anymore. In fact, they're living in a deep state of eternity now. And one of the big bumper stickers in the age of yoga and meditation is learning to be more present. And I get that. And I think, like, for me, to be in flow is to be present, because to be in flow shuts down the part of the brain that measures the passing of time. So you literally are in what Kotler calls the forever box. You know, when the athlete is in the zone, when the surfer is riding that wave, time no longer exists, right? And you also lose the inner chatter. So one of the hallmarks of flow is that the inner Woody Allen, the inner critic, which is apparently controlled by the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, that shuts down. People think they use more of their brain in flow. You lose less. The aperture focuses, as Jamie Wheel says. And so the inner chatter dissipates. You have this quiet stillness. The sense of time disappears, so you're in eternity now, right? And then there's this feeling of like information richness and effortlessness that's also transpiring. So you don't feel the labor of your actions, even though your performance level is through the roof. And the amount of information you have access to is so smooth. It's this constant stream of new, interpretable information. And there's actually a neuroscientist who I listened to a podcast on, and he was saying that human beings should be best described not as carnivores or herbivores, but as infovores, because we're only ever truly happy when we're eating new, interpretable information, which is one of the hallmarks of flow, more access to more information. But notice he says interpretable. Right? It has to be the sweet spot between chaos and order. Because too much information, if you're flooded with too much data, you become overwhelmed. You wipe out, you fall off the wave, you're drowning underwater. But if you have too little information, the water's flat, you're bored. Your mind starts ruminating about the future or the past. But perfect flow is the perfect wave, and it toes the line between chaos and order. It's access to new, interpretable information. And that's where we are our happiest, because we are infovores.
Damn. I can't believe that entire nugget of knowledge just streamed out of you.
Thanks, bro.
I'm sure you've got asked this question like 100 times.
Yeah, I think.
Or was that just your brain connecting in the way Jason Silva's brain connects?
So I've done some research on trying to explain what happens to me when I get wrapped up in explaining ideas. And first of all, what I've learned is I'm an associational thinker. So I learn by association, you know. And there's a line by a guy called Isaiah Berlin called "To understand is to perceive patterns." So connecting the dots and associational thinking, for me at least, is how I wrap my head around things. And what typically happens is, and this is probably because For me, flow is, again, totally the line between chaos and order. So flow is the intersection between discipline and surrender. So like too much discipline is oppressive and too much surrender is chaotic. When both are tensely balanced, you're in flow. And so, well, I would say that for me, these ideas, you know, they're coming at me, right? And the discipline part, the urge to explain, the urge to language, the urge to encapsulate is the part of me that's a control freak, is the part of me that's highly disciplined, that wants to make order out of chaos. But the part that invites exposure to new ideas, the part that avoids dogma, the part that is willing to question everything I thought I knew, the part that invites disorder is me bringing a little bit of cognitive disinhibition, because that's where all the new information comes in from. And so it's both, you know. I know a lot of people that tell me, Jason, just let go all the time, just surrender. You know, but if I just surrender, I wouldn't have the camera with me in the moment where the ideas are coming through. You know, obviously I'm getting out of my head for all this inspiration to happen, but I'm also highly disciplined. The camera's charged, the camera's there, I'm with the right person, and when the download is happening, it's like hit record on that. And I sense that you do something very similar. You know, I've noticed you in flow. I've noticed the way you run the conference, but I also see the machinations behind the scenes that are so highly disciplined. Even the fact that during this conversation, you still have the wherewithal to be like, don't forget about that camera. So I think that we're actually very similar.
Right. And what I appreciate about what you just said, which is so beautiful, and I wish I'd explained it as well as you just did. I was recently on Impact Theory with Tom Bilyeu, right? And Tom and I got into a debate. I love Tom.
Yeah.
And the debate was Tom is a proponent of hard work. Yeah. I'm a proponent of flow, right? And we were debating as friends, is it hard work or is it flow? And I was talking about Michael Singer's ideas of surrender, and you just worded it perfectly. It is the midpoint between discipline and surrender.
100%.
Now,
you would love this Venn diagram that my friend made. My friend makes these t-shirts from the Imaginary Foundation, and you should probably get that image and use it for some Mindvalley promotion.
The t-shirt you were wearing on stage?
So the one I was wearing is science and art, and it's a Venn diagram, and they intersect in wonder.
With wonder.
Science, wonder, art.
And what is this other?
So he has this other
Venn
one that's
diagram?
discipline, surrender, and they overlap in flow.
Oh, amazing.
Beautiful
amazing.
Venn diagram. Yeah.
So when I interviewed Stephen Kotler, in Peter Diamandis' book Bold, Peter Diamandis tries to take Kotler's list and dissect it into 13 different triggers of flow.
Okay.
Right? Now, when I interviewed Stephen Kotler, he gave me 5 triggers. And it seems that the number of triggers of flow or ways to get into flow are constantly adapting and changing. And there's sometimes disagreement among different people.
Sure.
How do you personally get in flow?
So one of the most consistent triggers for me is novelty. So like literally, I mean, I grew up in Venezuela. I went to an international school, so my friends were from all over the world. So I was constantly exposed to people from different customs, people who spoke different languages, people from different backgrounds. And it made me interested in finding both commonality between us, but also celebrating our quirky and alien differences, like all the ways in which we were not the same. And so in a way, that was a formative privilege for me, that I was exposed to novelty in terms of how people thought, how people acted, the cultures they belonged to. I used to do a lot of extreme sports growing up. I mean, not too extreme, but my dad was really into motocross. So you have novelty, access to novelty puts me into flow. Flow follows focus. So novel experiences, of course, you focus on them because they're new. When an environment is familiar, you're only going to notice what doesn't fit, the new piece of information. So novelty does it because flow follows focus. Extreme sports like motocross or anything that has a little bit of risk also focuses. You have no choice. You're deeply embodied in the activity because if you don't, you're going to fall off the bike, you know. Flow follows focus. So I would say for me, novelty and a little bit of risk. Now the risk doesn't just mean physical. It can be cognitive, intellectual, aesthetic, sometimes getting on stage. That is a high stakes game. You're responsible for delivering content to 500 or 1,000 people, and you better know your stuff. People feel adrenaline before going on stage. People fear public speaking more than anything in the world, but I think it's because they're misinterpreting what's happening. You feel adrenaline because that's your body preparing you for ultimate performance. And people call adrenaline fear. But if you just reframe it and you're like, no, that's your talent. That's like your body preparing you for actual action, for performance, So yeah, anything that raises the stakes, anything that throws me into novelty, and I guess this is related to novelty, aesthetically relevant experiences. So movie watching is a huge flow inducer for me. Now, I'm somebody who has often an active mind, and sometimes I get a little bit of bandwidth anxiety where I have trouble deciding what's the thing that deserves my attention the most in a particular moment, because I want to pay attention to the thing that is the most important thing for me to pay attention to. Like, I really want to be judicious in where I place my attention. And I think what I like about good cinema is that it's like trusting a good restaurateur, and a good chef. I'm in your hands. Right. For me, the experience of submitting to the work of a great director is like I'm going to sit in the dark and I'm submitting completely. I'm literally resigning myself and I'm in his hands. It's a trust fall, and that also gives me flow. And people who love control, like I do, people who are highly disciplined, need to make sure that they have access to experiences in which they can do trust falls. I think that because I have this relationship between discipline and surrender, and when they meet, I'm in flow. But I still have a predisposition more towards discipline and overthinking and planning and wanting to plan and wanting to control things. And that has served me well as long as I find safe outlets for surrender. So bring in all the discipline, all the preparation up until the moment in which it's time to let go. Right? Perfection is not just about control, it's also about letting go. But it's not just about letting go either. You know what I mean? It is towing that line. And something that's really interesting was this study that was published, I think, by the folks at Imperial College of London on the relationship between mental health and the entropic states of the brain. Mm-hmm. So, and we can get into this if you like, but now there's this whole thing happening where we're having an epidemic of mental distress. Anxiety and depression are going through the roof. Incidences of suicide are really high. And one of these things that this article was saying is that the diseases of depression and anxiety stem from a brain that has become overly ordered, like too ordered. So if you think of the ego as the organizing autobiographical mind, the chief executive of the brain, it's like the CEO has become a dictator and a terrible tyrant, as David Foster Wallace used to describe it. And so an overly active default mode network, which is the seat of the ego in the brain, and it can be overly active either from trauma or from certain experiences that have made you, so then you're like this, like a brain that has become too ordered is more subject to the pathologies of excessive rumination and self-consciousness that characterize depression and anxiety. It's what people that get like looping obsessive thoughts, and they get like stuck in this like wiring, And so one of the ways to treat these illnesses in sort of some of the most compelling research now happening with psychedelic psychotherapy and so on has been described as an experience that shakes the snow globe. So if you have these grooves that have like gotten so cemented in your brain, and you have these looping patterns in your thinking and obsessive thinking and the rumination of anxiety and depression, that you need an experience that shakes the snow globe, so that all of those like carved grooves of thought like dissolve, and then it's like, oh, okay, I get to be reset. It's like you're defragmenting the hard drive, and so anyway, it's interesting, this relationship between chaos and order playing out at that level. So too much order is depression and anxiety. Conversely, too much disorder are the personality disorders of bipolar, schizophrenia, and those are when the brain is too disorganized.
Wow,
too chaotic.
That's a remarkable way of explaining it.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about altered states.
Sure.
Because Kotler speaks about that a lot.
Yeah.
He talks about how we live in a monophasic society.
Okay.
Indigenous cultures are polyphasic. And when I see you go on a Jason Silva riff, right? Or when you get on stage, even when you answer a question here, are you accessing any type of alpha, theta,
I don't know if
altered state?
It's possible. I've definitely, the most compelling altered states experience that I have had has been mediated by cannabis, which has now been largely normalized and legalized in California. But cannabis is an interesting substance. It's been used for millennia for medicinal purposes and also for spiritual purposes. And spiritual purposes is just a stand-in word for an altered state of consciousness, something that changes the way you see the world, connects you seemingly with something larger than yourself. And so people just label that spiritual, But I'm interested in what's going on. Like, what are the mechanisms of that altered state of perception? Like, why is that happening? Flow Genome Project research that Kotler has done talks about the 4 forces of ecstasy: psychology, technology, neurobiology, and pharmacology. So psychology is having an essence of like how your brain works and how it's going to react in certain situations and what are your triggers and so on and so forth. Technology might be like, putting like a little thing attached to your brain that's reading your brain waves so you can get feedback of how your brain is acting in situations. Neurobiology is understanding like the neurotransmitters, dopamine, anandamide, norepinephrine, and the flow cycles and how these neurotransmitters metabolize and when is the optimum time for them to flood your system and so on and so forth. But the last one is pharmacology. Pharmacology, we're essentially talking about drugs. We're talking about substances that are outside that we take in and they interact with our brain chemistry, and in doing so, they change our perception of the world. And they also change how we process information. And one of the hallmarks of cannabis intoxication is that it's marvelous for associations. It's marvelous for associational thinking. And it has a rich history of being used in improvisational arts. Jazz musicians, freestyle raps, creative artists of all types, writers, anything that requires you to imaginatively connect one concept to the next, whether it's one melody that becomes the next melody, or whether it's a freestyle rapper that's like going off on some rhymes and all he's getting is triggers from the person, like they throw him a word, they throw him a phrase, and then he's just, it's like a butterfly effect in thought. It's associational thinking. It's this concept forging a link between this concept and that concept and how they are related. You're synthesizing and you're finding through lines in various ideas. And doing that is an organizing principle of making sense of things, I believe. And I think we all have that to a certain degree, and I think something like cannabis, what it does is it expands your associative net. So it gives you an experience of that associational thinking that's broadened, right? It's like an italization of your thoughts. And I think that you can learn from that experience, that altered state experience, and the insights of how that works is something that your brain, I think, can remember, so that even when you're not high on cannabis, that is a muscle that has now been exercise. Once a mind is stretched by a new idea, it never returns to its original position. So it is my view that the practiced encounter with altered states in a context that has intentionality, like, okay, how am I gonna, like these studies that were done in the 60s where engineers were given LSD, and then in a context of problem solving. They were like, bring a problem that's been bothering you at the office that you really can't seem to solve, and then they'd put them in this comfortable living room-like environment. They'd give them a little bit of LSD, and they'd have them work on the problem that's been bothering them. So they set up a context for it, It wasn't like, oh, go have a spiritual experience or go talk to God. This was like, no, bring an engineering problem, take a little bit of LSD, and then work on the engineering problem, And the point is that the altered perception, the increased associational thinking, the heightened pattern recognition, the boosting of the lateral thinking, all these things that Kotler talks about, that's like, I just think it's a muscle that then gets exercised, and I don't think that people have to be taking these substances all the time. I think it's one way of just, engendering a capacity to think about things in a certain way, or deploying a certain way of thinking when you engage with the world and engage with problems.
That's fantastic.
Ideas.
I love how you explain that.
Thanks.
In closing, what would be your final piece of advice to the world?
My final piece of advice to the world.
So one can live in wonder, live in awe.
Yeah. I think, I don't believe in fatalism. So no matter how dark things get for each and every one of us, and we all will have our dark night of the soul, my piece of advice to people is remember that things can get better, that every problem has a solution, that when things are dark and when things are bloody, it's not that the end is near necessarily, but that the beginning is near. I like the metaphor of the birth canal. Sometimes the most difficult moments, the most bottlenecked moments, the moments when we can't breathe, might just be the birth canal. We might just be the chrysalis about to turn into a butterfly. We might just, we have to remember, we might just be able to push through the darkness and arrive at the other side of fear, which is where everything we wanted is. The cave you fear holds the treasure you seek, said Joseph Campbell. And so my advice is to try to remember that and lean into that.
Amazing. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you.
That was awesome.
Beautiful. Thank you.